Hey everyone, I've noticed that many of you are enjoying the videos, but most of you haven't subscribed yet. We're super close to hitting 1,000 subscribers, and your support could help us reach that milestone. If you're enjoying the content, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really makes a huge difference and helps us keep creating more awesome content. Thank you so much for watching and supporting. I used to think my life was ordinary, not perfect, not some fairy tale, but stable enough to keep going without questioning everything. I worked long hours from home, staring at a computer screen, trying to make ends meet as a freelance graphic designer. Rachel, my wife, had a stable job, sales rep at some tech company. I didn't ask too many questions about it. Maybe that was the first mistake. But looking back, there were signs. Signs I either ignored or was too blind to see. Now it's all I can think about. It started small, just a flicker of doubt. Rachel had been getting home later than usual, always with some excuse. The office is drowning in work, she'd say, or Brad's been dumping projects on me. You know how it is. Brad, the name lingered in the air too long, stretched out, almost like she was testing how I'd react. I didn't, not right away. He was her coworker, just a guy she mentioned offhand sometimes. But something in the way she said his name felt off. One night after she came home particularly late, I noticed her phone buzzing on the kitchen counter while she was in the shower. It wasn't like me to snoop, and honestly, I wasn't even planning to. But the screen lit up, and there it was, his name, Brad. The text preview flashed briefly. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Last night was... The rest got cut off, and I felt a knot tighten in my gut. I froze, staring at the phone. My hands were suddenly damp. It would have been so easy to pick it up, to scroll through her messages and confirm everything I was starting to fear. But I didn't. Not yet. Maybe I didn't want to believe it. I heard the water stop in the bathroom, her footsteps padding down the hall, and I stepped back from the counter, heart racing. What was I supposed to do? Confront her now? No, I wasn't ready. I couldn't act on a gut feeling, not without proof. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe Brad really was just a coworker, and my mind was twisting things. I needed to wait. I needed to see more. The next few days were torture. I couldn't focus on my work, couldn't stop playing the scenarios over in my head. Every time Rachel smiled at me, it felt forced. I analyzed every word she said, every glance she threw my way, searching for something I wasn't sure I wanted to find. But the cracks were there, small at first, but spreading like spider webs across a glass window. We went to dinner with friends that weekend, a casual night out at a steakhouse we used to love. The tension followed me like a dark cloud, and I was certain Rachel could feel it too. She barely looked at me, and when she did, her eyes darted away too quickly. I noticed her checking her phone under the table more than once, her face softening with whatever she was reading. It wasn't until Brad showed up at our table, completely unexpected, that things started to click into place. He walked in with a few people from her office, laughing like he owned the damn place. He spotted us, gave Rachel a smile that was just a little too familiar, and nodded as if we were old friends. He barely acknowledged me. I felt my blood start to simmer. The rest of the night was a blur of forced conversation and fake laughter. I tried to watch them without being obvious, catching the stolen glances, the way Brad leaned in too close when he spoke to her. She didn't pull back. That night, after we got home, Rachel went straight to bed, claiming exhaustion. I stayed in the living room staring at the darkened TV screen. Her phone was on the coffee table. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind spinning in circles, telling myself to pick it up, to finally rip the bandage off. But I couldn't. By the time I crawled into bed, my body was tense, the weight of suspicion pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. Rachel was already asleep, or pretending to be. I lay there listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing, wondering if I'd ever look at her the same way again. The following week was hell. Rachel's late nights at the office became more frequent, and Brad's name popped up in conversation more often, always in passing, as if he were just a casual work friend. But I knew better now. I couldn't prove it yet, but I knew. I started paying closer attention. The little things she said, the way she dressed for work, the new perfume I didn't remember her wearing before. There were phone calls she'd taken in another room, her voice low, almost a whisper. Every time she told me she had to work late, my stomach churned. I found myself picturing them together. Rachel and Brad, laughing behind my back, sharing secrets, and God knows what else. It was tearing me apart inside. I tried to confront her without actually confronting her, asking casual questions about her day, trying to gauge her reactions. But Rachel was smooth, too smooth. She'd smile, give me some vague answer about how work was hectic, and then move on like nothing was wrong. I was losing my grip on reality, and she wasn't giving me a damn thing to hold on to. But that changed one night, a Wednesday, when Rachel came home even later than usual. She smelled like a bar, beer and cheap cologne, and when I asked her how work was, she just shrugged and said she was too tired to talk about it. She went straight to bed, but this time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed her phone from the nightstand, heart hammering in my chest, fingers shaking. I scrolled through her messages until I found Brad's name. There it was, confirmation in black and white. Last night was amazing. Can't stop thinking about you. My world split open in that moment. Every suspicion, every doubt, every gut-wrenching feeling I'd had for weeks now solidified into cold, hard truth. She was cheating on me. My wife, the woman I'd spent nearly a decade with, was sleeping with someone else. I stood there in the dim light of our bedroom, staring down at her, sleeping peacefully. How could she? How could she lie to me night after night, come home to me after being with him? I wanted to wake her up, shake her, scream at her, demand answers. But I didn't. I couldn't. Not yet. I put the phone back down, quietly, and walked out of the room. My hands were trembling, and my throat was tight with the words I couldn't say. The anger was there, bubbling just beneath the surface, but so was the hurt. The kind of hurt that lodges itself deep in your chest and twists until you can't breathe. I felt small, humiliated, like my entire life had been some kind of joke, and they were the punchline. I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the wall. The rage I thought would consume me didn't. Instead, a different thought crept in, calm, methodical. This wasn't the end. This wasn't where it stopped. If she thought she could get away with this, if she thought I was weak, she had no idea who I really was. I wasn't going to confront her now, not in the heat of the moment. No, I was going to wait. I was going to plan. She didn't deserve my anger yet, not until I was ready to show her just how wrong she was. Rachel had made her move. Now it was my turn. And when I was done, they'd both regret ever underestimating me. I had the proof now. The text from Brad was all the confirmation I needed, but it didn't make the sting any less sharp. The truth sat there, glaring at me like a wound I couldn't stop picking at. Rachel was still fast asleep when I slipped out of the bedroom. I couldn't bear to lie next to her, pretending things were normal. I ended up on the couch again, mind racing, trying to piece together the last few months. Every lie, every smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Every night she came home smelling like someone else. What did I miss? I kept asking myself that question, over and over, as if answering it would somehow make the betrayal hurt less. I replayed our conversations, dinners, even the silence between us when we were both too tired to pretend anymore. It wasn't just one thing. It was a million little cracks that I'd ignored until the whole thing caved in on me. In the days that followed, I tried to act like nothing had changed. I pretended to be the same husband I'd been before, though maybe with fewer questions, less eye contact. I wasn't ready to tip my hand, not yet. I needed more. I needed to understand the full extent of what was happening. Rachel made it easy for me to gather the clues. She didn't hide much anymore, probably because she thought she didn't need to. Her phone was glued to her hand most nights, and when it wasn't, she kept it face down on the table, locked. A few times I caught her sneaking off to the bathroom in the middle of dinner to answer a call or respond to a text. When I asked who it was, she'd brush it off, say it was work or a friend or nothing I needed to worry about. It was becoming harder to keep the facade going, harder to swallow down the bitterness and the rage, but I still wasn't ready for confrontation. I couldn't just explode. That's what she'd expect. That's what Brad would expect. And I wasn't going to give either of them the satisfaction. But the tension between us was thickening. Conversations were strained, every word weighted. When Rachel talked, I found myself studying her face for signs. Was there guilt behind her smile? Was that forced laugh a cover for her lies? I couldn't tell. She was good at this. Too good. And that pissed me off more than anything. How long had she been doing this? How many times had she looked me in the eye and lied through her teeth? One night, she came home later than usual. Again. I was sitting in the living room, the lights dimmed, my laptop open in front of me. She walked in, tossed her keys on the counter, and barely glanced at me before heading straight to the bedroom. "Late night?" I asked, keeping my voice as casual as I could manage. I didn't even look up from my screen. She paused in the doorway, her hand resting on the frame for a second too long before answering. "Yeah, work's been crazy lately." Work, always work. I wanted to laugh, but I didn't. Instead, I nodded, pretending to buy into her story, pretending that everything was fine, that I wasn't picturing her with Brent every time she left the house. "Don't wait up," she added, her tone flat, emotionless. Then she disappeared down the hallway, leaving me alone with my thoughts. That night, I didn't wait up. I wasn't the one sleeping on the couch this time, though. She was. I took her laptop instead. It had been a few days since I first read Brad's message, and I knew there had to be more. It was time to go deeper, time to find out just how far this betrayal went. Rachel was a creature of habit, and that included being lazy with her passwords. I had an idea of what it might be, our anniversary, her dog's name growing up. Something stupid. And I was right. The second I opened her laptop and typed in Benny 9092, it had unlocked. My pulse quickened, my hands slightly shaking as I pulled up her email. I was half expecting her to have covered her tracks, but apparently she wasn't as cautious as I thought. There they were, dozens of emails between her and Brad. Some were innocent, work-related, but others were far from it. They started months ago, maybe longer than I'd even suspected. The tone of them shifted over time, from professional to playful, then personal, and finally explicit. The emails were full of passion, desire, and inside jokes, things I had no idea about. Things she'd never shared with me. I felt sick. I kept scrolling, the nausea building as the details became clearer. They'd planned nights together when I thought she was working late. They'd shared lunches, private jokes. They talked about me like I was a non-factor, like I was just an obstacle, something in the way of their perfect little romance. I read one that stopped me cold. Brad had written it about a month ago. "He doesn't deserve you. You should leave him. We could have our own life together, no secrets." Her response came quickly after, "I'm working on it. It's complicated. Be patient." Complicated. That was what my marriage had boiled down to for her, a complication. A problem she needed to fix before she could run off with Brad and start their fresh new life. I closed the laptop, my hands trembling. It wasn't just the affair. It was the blatant disregard for me, for what we'd built together. She wasn't just cheating. She was planning her exit strategy, calculating when and how she'd leave me for him. It wasn't a matter of if anymore, but when. I sat there in the dark, my heart pounding, my vision blurring with anger, but I didn't act on it. Not yet. Instead, I stared at the wall and let the silence settle over me like a shroud. The betrayal wasn't just about sex or lies. It was about being disposable, replaceable, and that was something I couldn't forgive. The next few days were spent in a haze. I went through the motions of my life, but the anger simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to boil over. Rachel was oblivious to my growing resentment. She kept up her routine, her lies, as if nothing was wrong, as if she could keep this charade going forever. But I knew better now. One night she mentioned she had to go on a business trip for the weekend. "It's just a couple of days," she said over dinner. "Corporate retreat. Everyone's going." My eyes narrowed, though I kept my expression neutral. "That sounds nice. Where's it at?" She paused, her fork halfway to her mouth, as if the question caught her off guard. Upstate. Some resort. Are you driving or carpooling with someone? She shrugged, then quickly recovered. Probably carpooling, less hassle. I just nodded. Inside, though, something snapped into place. I'd been playing nice long enough. It was time to push back. Time to start setting my own plan into motion. That night after she went to bed, I sat down with her laptop again. This time, I wasn't looking for answers. I already had those. This time, I was looking for leverage. I started with her emails, scanning through work correspondence until I found what I needed. A trail of messages between her and Brad, some of which were borderline inappropriate for coworkers. I knew exactly where to send them. I took screenshots, cataloging everything I could. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became. This wasn't just an affair, it was a full-scale betrayal, one that stretched beyond our marriage and into her professional life. Brad was involved too, covering for her, pulling strings. They were in this together, and that was going to be their downfall. I gathered the evidence, saving it onto a flash drive. I wasn't sure yet what I'd do with it, but having it felt like a small victory, like I was starting to regain control. Over the next few days, I played the part of the oblivious husband. Rachel continued her routine, but now I saw everything with fresh eyes. The way she smiled when she talked about work. The way she always mentioned Brad in passing, as if he was just another colleague. She didn't realize I was 2 steps ahead of her now. Then came the day of her so-called business trip. She packed her bags, kissed me on the cheek, and told me she'd see me in a couple of days. I watched her go, standing by the window as her car disappeared down the street. The second she was gone, I made my move. I started by locking down our shared bank account. I didn't know how deep her plans went, but I wasn't going to let her take me for everything I had. I transferred my savings into a separate account, changed all the passwords. It was a small but necessary step, one that gave me a sliver of control over the situation. Then I turned my attention back to the evidence I'd collected. I had the emails, the texts, it was time to send them off. I drafted an anonymous email, attached the screenshots, and sent them directly to her HR department. It didn't take long for them to respond. By the end of the day, she was under investigation. Brad, too. I felt a surge of satisfaction as I imagined the fallout. I knew it wouldn't take long for the truth to spread, for the whispers to start. By the time she got back from her business trip, her world would be crumbling, just like mine had. I didn't sleep that night. My mind wouldn't let me. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of Rachel with Brad, their emails full of passion, the brazen way they'd talked about our life, flashed behind my eyelids like a sick movie I couldn't turn off. My thoughts ran wild, but one thing became clear. I needed to regain control. That wasn't going to happen by screaming, crying, or confronting her in the heat of anger. That's what they'd expect. I needed to play the long game. I sat at the kitchen table sipping coffee as dawn broke, the cool light creeping through the blinds. I stared at my phone, checking for any more messages from Rachel's work, but nothing came. Maybe I'd overestimated the speed at which things would unravel. Still, I wasn't worried. I'd set the wheels in motion. What was gnawing at me wasn't the speed of the fallout. It was the thought of Rachel and Brad thinking they could just keep going, get away with it all while I stayed quiet, too broken to act. And that made me sick to my stomach. I wasn't some passive loser waiting for his life to fall apart. I was going to make sure they knew exactly who they were messing with. The first thing I did was secure my finances. I spent hours on the phone with banks, closing our joint accounts, opening new ones in my name only. Rachel would wake up tomorrow with no access to the money, no quick escape route. She wouldn't even know it until she tried to use her card. I wasn't leaving anything to chance. Every penny was going to be accounted for. And when she tried to take something from me, she'd find herself empty-handed. The house was trickier. I couldn't exactly throw her out, at least not yet. Legally, it was still hers too, but I could start separating myself from it, laying the groundwork for what would come. I changed the locks on the office where I kept all my important files, locked away everything that mattered to me. She wasn't going to touch any of it when the time came for her to pack up and go. My plan wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming my space, my life. That evening I drove around the city thinking. I passed by Rachel's office, glanced up at the building, wondering if she was still there, lying to whoever crossed her path, pretending her life was normal. I wondered if Brad was there too. Smug bastard. I imagined him laughing about how he'd outplayed me, how he'd stolen her right from under my nose. They probably thought I was too weak to do anything. I smiled to myself. They had no idea. That's when I saw him, Brad, strolling out of the office alone, his tie loosened, looking cocky as ever. It was like fate handed him to me. The urge to follow him was instinctive. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my heart pounding in my ears, and before I even thought it through, I was tailing him. Brad didn't seem to have a care in the world. He didn't even notice the old car behind him, following him through the city, whining toward a bar I recognize. Typical. He didn't even go home to Rachel. He had his own life, his own space. My wife was just a side dish to him. That made my blood boil. I parked a few blocks away, watching him walk inside. He had no clue who I was watching. No clue that the husband of the woman he was sleeping with was sitting in the shadows, his entire world about to crumble. It was tempting to walk in after him, confront him, tell him I knew everything, and see the look on his face when he realized I wasn't the fool he thought I was. But I stopped myself. This wasn't the time. Not yet. It would be too easy, too simple to blow up now. I had to be smart, precise. The next step was Rachel's work. I spent the next few days collecting more evidence, pulling together everything I needed to send their affair spiraling into the public eye. If her HR department hadn't responded yet, I'd make them. The thing about corporate jobs was they hated scandals. They'd do anything to avoid bad press, especially when it came to inappropriate relationships between coworkers. And I had more than enough to cause a storm. Rachel came back from her business trip 2 days later, breezing into the house like everything was normal. She dropped her bag by the door, glanced over at me on the couch, and smiled like she hadn't just spent the weekend with another man. "How was it?" I asked, my voice as neutral as I could keep it. "Exhausting," she sighed. "Lots of team building. You know how it is." I nodded, watching her as she moved through the living room, completely unaware that I knew everything. She poured herself a glass of wine, sinking into the couch beside me like nothing had changed. It took everything in me to keep from grabbing her by the shoulders and demanding to know why, how she could sit there and lie to my face so easily. But I didn't. I kept calm. I kept my mask on, letting her believe I was the same oblivious fool I'd always been. My time would come. And it was coming soon. 2 days later, the first bomb dropped. It started as a whisper at Rachel's office. Brad was placed on leave. I knew it would come eventually. Corporate HR had finally acted on the anonymous emails I'd sent. The texts, the photos of their inappropriate exchanges, were too damning to ignore. They couldn't risk the liability of keeping him around. Rachel hadn't said anything to me yet, but I could see the tension building in her, the cracks starting to form. That night, she came home later than usual, her face tight with worry. She didn't even kiss me when she walked in. Just dropped her bag on the floor, poured herself a drink, and sank into the couch, staring at nothing. "What's wrong?" I asked, playing the part of the concerned husband. "Works." "Stressful," she muttered, taking a long sip. "Some shit's going down. Brad's been suspended." I acted surprised. "What happened?" She glanced at me, her eyes darting away quickly. "I'm not sure. Something about inappropriate conduct. It's bullshit, really." I fought back the urge to smirk. Inappropriate conduct. They weren't even using the word affair yet, but they would. The corporate world liked to soften the blow, but the scandal was spreading. Over the next week, I watched as Rachel unraveled. She didn't tell me everything, but I didn't need her to. I heard her on the phone late at night whispering furiously to someone, probably Brad, trying to figure out what was going on. I heard the panic in her voice, the frustration. I could imagine her fear. The carefully crafted web they'd spun was falling apart. I fed off her anxiety. I let her stew in it. I let her wonder who was behind it all. who had blown the whistle on their little love affair. But she never suspected me. I was too good at playing the fool. One night, just when I thought things couldn't get any better, Brad showed up at our door. I wasn't expecting him, but the second I saw his face, I knew this was going to be the next turning point. He looked haggard, like a man who was rapidly losing control of his life. His eyes were dark, his face tense, as if the weight of everything was finally catching up to him. "Rachel here?" he asked, his voice tight. I could barely contain the satisfaction in my chest as I stood in the doorway, blocking his way. "No," I said casually. "She's not home yet." He stared at me, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "You know about us, don't you?" I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch out, watching him squirm. Then I smiled, just slightly, enough to make him feel unsettled. "Yeah," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "I know everything." He didn't flinch, didn't even try to deny it. He knew the jig was up, and now, standing there in front of me, he looked smaller, weaker. The smug confidence he'd once carried was gone. "Look," he started, his voice low, almost pleading. "Rachel's going to leave you. We both know it. This thing, it's already done. There's no point in dragging it out." I smiled wider now. "You think it's over?" He frowned, clearly not expecting that response. "You think she's just going to walk away, and you'll live happily ever after?" I shook my head, stepping closer to him, lowering my voice. "You have no idea what's coming, Brad." He blinked, clearly thrown off by my calmness. "What the hell does that mean?" I didn't answer him. I didn't have to. He was already feeling the pressure, already unraveling, and that was enough for now. I wanted him to leave here tonight unsure, scared. I wanted him to realize that this was just the beginning. Rachel came home a few hours later, her face pale, her expression tight. She didn't say much, just walked straight into the bedroom and shut the door behind her. I knew she'd gotten another call from work. I knew her world was crumbling faster than she could fix it, and soon she'd know just how much control she'd lost. But I wasn't done. Rachel was unraveling faster than I expected. After Brad's suspension, she started pacing the house like a trapped animal, eyes darting, phone constantly in her hand. She kept it close now, tighter than ever, as if she could clutch control back from the chaos that had begun. I knew it wouldn't work. She was losing grip on both her personal life and her professional world, but the way she stared at me, with suspicion growing in her eyes, told me I needed to be careful. One evening, she finally confronted me. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping a beer and scrolling aimlessly on my phone, when she slammed hers down on the counter with enough force to rattle the salt shaker. "What's going on with the accounts, Mark?" Her voice was sharp, strained. I could see the tension pulling at the corners of her mouth, the same way a liar's guilt starts to show when they realize the lie is slipping out of their control. I glanced up lazily, masking the satisfaction that crawled up my throat. "What do you mean?" "Don't play dumb," she spat, stepping closer, her hand gripping the edge of the counter. "I tried to use my card today, and it got declined. The bank said the account was closed." I raised an eyebrow, keeping my tone as flat as I could. "I thought we needed to make some adjustments. You know, cut down on expenses." Her eyes narrowed, and I saw the flicker of realization starting to set in. She didn't say anything for a moment, but I could see her mind working, piecing things together. I kept my expression neutral, not giving her an inch. "This is about Brad, isn't it?" she asked finally, her voice low, the venom barely concealed. I took a sip of my beer, staring at her over the rim of the bottle. I didn't answer right away, and that silence, the weight of it, hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. I wanted her to feel it, to understand just how far this had gone. "You think you can just control everything, don't you?" she continued, stepping closer. "You think cutting off the money and making these stupid little moves is going to stop me?" My stomach twisted, not with fear, but with anger. Her audacity was staggering. After everything she'd done, she was still playing the victim, still acting like I was the one overreacting, like I hadn't seen her planning my replacement right under my nose. "I'm not trying to stop you, Rachel," I said, leaning back in my chair. I'm just making sure you can't walk away from this as easily as you thought. Her face paled for a moment, and then she stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door to the bedroom behind her. I sat there in the silence, the sound of her footsteps fading down the hallway, and let myself smile. She was scared now, desperate. And when people get desperate, they make mistakes. The next morning, I woke early and went through my routine as usual, pretending everything was fine. Rachel didn't speak to me, didn't look at me, but I didn't need her to. I had all the confirmation I needed. She was cracking, and Brad was nowhere to be seen. Not a text or call from him in sight. My plan was working, but it wasn't time to celebrate just yet. I logged into the private email I'd set up specifically for this. I had the HR department's response saved, and a few new messages had come in since. The investigation was heating up, and now it was starting to ripple through the office. Whispers were turning into questions, questions into rumors. That was the beauty of corporate life. Once the rot started, it was almost impossible to stop. People loved to watch the downfall of someone higher up, but there was more I needed to do. HR was one thing, but I wanted to take this public. I wanted their names to be synonymous with disgrace, to make sure there was no corner they could hide in without their dirty laundry following them. So I took my time crafting the next phase. Rachel and Brad had been careful with their affair, mostly. But like all arrogant people, they'd slipped up. There were photos from work events, posts on social media where they thought they were being clever, standing just close enough without raising alarms. But I'd noticed, and now I was piecing it all together. I created a file, a dossier really, of every single detail I had, emails, texts, photos. The explicit messages between them were damning enough, but adding in the work violations, that was the nail in their coffin. I sent it off to a few key local blogs under an anonymous tip. I knew one or two reporters who loved to run with scandalous stories, especially when it involved local companies with reputations to protect. I could almost hear the ticking of the bomb I just planted. The first article hit 2 days later. I watched Rachel that morning, sitting across from her at the breakfast table as she scrolled through her phone. It started with her frown, the way her eyes widened as she scrolled further, faster, her fingers shaking. She dropped the phone onto the table, her face drained of all color. I stayed quiet, just watching, waiting. They published it, she whispered, barely able to get the words out. I leaned forward, feigning confusion. Published what? She swallowed hard, her voice cracking. The affair, they published it. They're calling it a scandal. HR is involved, and Brad what? I asked, keeping my tone neutral, even though my heart was pounding in satisfaction. She shook her head, staring blankly at the screen. He's been suspended indefinitely. They're doing an internal investigation. It's over. Her voice broke on the last word, and for a brief moment I saw it. Fear, pure, unadulterated fear. Not just for her relationship with Brad, but for everything. Her job, her reputation, her life. She'd spent so long building this facade, and now it was crumbling around her. I stood up from the table, letting the silence sit for a moment before walking over to her side. I placed a hand on her shoulder, forcing her to look up at me. It's over, I repeated softly. You made sure of that. She recoiled, pulling away from my touch as if I'd burned her. But she didn't respond. She couldn't. There was nothing left to say. Over the next few days, the story spread like wildfire. Local blogs picked it up, then some regional outlets followed suit. The scandal surrounding Brad and Rachel wasn't just office gossip anymore. It was public humiliation. She stayed home more, locking herself in the bedroom for hours at a time, ignoring my attempts at conversation. Brad, I assumed, was holed up somewhere as well, licking his wounds. But I wasn't finished. Brad started acting out, as I expected he would. The calls to Rachel increased, though they were more frantic now, desperate. I caught her yelling at him on the phone late at night. She wasn't the cool, collected woman she pretended to be anymore. She was frantic, angry, unraveling with every passing second. One night I overheard her telling him they had to meet, that they needed to talk about what was happening. I could hear the panic in her voice, the strain. She sounded cornered, trapped by a situation that was spiraling out of control. I stayed quiet, pretending to sleep as she whispered furiously into her phone. The next day, she left the house in a hurry, barely muttering something about going out. I knew exactly where she was going. She was going to meet Brad. I followed her. It wasn't hard to figure out where they'd go. Brad had a place just outside the city, some sleazy little apartment where I imagined they'd met up countless times before. I parked a block away, watching her car pull up to the curb. She glanced around, paranoid, before getting out and hurrying inside. I sat in my car, waiting. The hours passed slowly, and for a while I wondered if I should just storm in, confront them both. But no, that wasn't the plan. I couldn't blow everything now. I was too close to the finish line. Finally, the door to the apartment opened. Rachel stepped out, looking flustered, her face red, her movements rushed. Brad followed behind her, looking equally disheveled. They argued for a moment on the porch, their voices raised just enough for me to hear bits and pieces. "I can't fix this, Rachel," Brad shouted, his hands thrown in the air. "Do you understand that? It's over. We're done." Rachel tried to grab his arm, pleading, but he shrugged her off and stormed back into the apartment, slamming the door in her face. She stood there for a moment, frozen, before she finally turned and walked back to her car. I let her leave, let her drive off without knowing I was right behind her the whole time. This was it, the final unraveling. Brad was done with her, and now she had no one left to turn to. When she got home that evening, I was already there, sitting at the kitchen table, waiting. She walked in, her face drawn, pale. She didn't even look at me as she dropped her keys onto the counter. "How was your day?" I asked, my voice casual, almost pleasant. She froze, her back still to me. Slowly she turned around, her eyes hollow. "Mark," I smiled, leaning forward. "Tell me, Rachel. How does it feel to lose everything?" The weight of my words hit her like a brick. I leaned back in my chair, letting the words settle between us. Rachel just stared at me, her eyes wide, unblinking. She looked as if she wanted to say something, maybe scream or curse at me, but nothing came. It was like she couldn't process what was happening. Her entire world had fallen apart, and she hadn't seen it coming until it was too late. I could see the fear etched into her features now, the realization that everything she'd taken for granted, everything she thought she controlled, was gone. You did this," she whispered, her voice shaky, but with a desperate edge of accusation. I smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was the smile of a man who had played his part perfectly. "No, Rachel, you did this. You and Brad." Her face crumpled, and she looked away, unable to meet my eyes. She knew the truth, even if she didn't want to admit it. She had set all of this in motion when she decided I wasn't enough for her, when she thought Brad could give her something better, something more. But now, everything she had gambled on was slipping away. I stood up slowly, walking around the table toward her. She flinched as I approached, stepping back, but there was nowhere left for her to go. I stopped inches from her, close enough to see the tears welling in her eyes, the raw panic clinging to her like a second skin. "Where's Brad?" I asked, my voice low, almost a whisper. She shook her head. "I don't know. He left. He won't answer my calls." I let out a soft laugh. "Of course he did. He's a coward, Rachel. Did you really think he was going to stick around when things got tough? He's running because he knows what's coming next." Her head snapped up at that, confusion flashing in her eyes. "What do you mean?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed on the table. I glanced at it, my heart speeding up as I saw the name flashing across the screen. It was time. I picked up the phone, holding it to my ear. "Yeah?" The voice on the other end was calm, professional. "We're ready. Everything's in place." "Good," I said, glancing back at Rachel. "Do it." I hung up and pocketed the phone. Rachel was staring at me now, her mouth slightly open, her brow furrowed in confusion. What did you just do?" I didn't answer. Instead, I walked to the front door, pulling it open. "Come on, we've got somewhere to be." She hesitated, her fear palpable, but after a long moment, she followed. We drove in silence, the tension between us thick and oppressive. She didn't ask where we were going, and I didn't offer any explanations. I knew her mind was racing, trying to piece together what was happening, but there was no way she could predict what was about to unfold. When we pulled up to the venue, she blinked in surprise. It was a restaurant, a fancy one, the kind we used to go to for special occasions. I could see people through the large windows, dressed in formal attire, mingling and chatting, their laughter filtering through the glass. Rachel turned to me, her confusion deepening. "What is this?" I stepped out of the car, motioning for her to follow. "You'll see." She hesitated again, but finally climbed out, trailing behind me as we walked inside. The maitre d' greeted us with a smile, clearly expecting us. "Right this way, sir." We were led through the dining area, past tables of people who glanced curiously at us as we passed. Rachel stayed close behind me, her eyes darting nervously around, her hands wringing together. She had no idea what was happening, and that was exactly how I wanted it. Finally, we reached a private room at the back of the restaurant. The door was closed, but I could hear the low hum of conversation coming from inside. The maitre d' nodded at me before stepping away, leaving us alone. I turned to Rachel, watching her face for a moment. She looked terrified, on the edge of breaking down completely. "Mark, please," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just tell me what's going on." I ignored her, pushing open the door. Inside, the room was full of familiar faces, her parents, her brother, my parents. A few of her close friends. They all turned as we entered, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern. They had no idea why they'd been invited here tonight, no idea what was about to happen. But Brad knew. He was standing in the corner, pale and shaking, his eyes flicking between me and Rachel like a cornered animal. He looked as if he hadn't slept in days, his suit rumpled, his hair a mess. He had the look of a man who had been running from something he couldn't escape. Rachel froze beside me, her breath catching in her throat as she saw him. "Brad?" she whispered, taking a step forward, but I blocked her path. "No," I said, my voice firm. "We're going to do this right." I turned to the room, addressing them all. "Thank you all for coming tonight. I know this was unexpected, but there's something that needs to be said, something Rachel has been hiding." Rachel's eyes widened in panic, her hand flying to her mouth. "Mark, don't!" But I didn't stop. I pulled out my phone, opening the file I had prepared. Rachel and Brad have been having an affair. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs of disbelief. Rachel's mother covered her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Her father stood up, his face red with anger. My own parents exchanged a glance, as if they had suspected something was wrong but never imagined this. Rachel stumbled backward, shaking her head. No, it's not like that. Mark, please." I ignored her. "I have proof, emails, photos, texts. They've been lying to all of us for months, thinking they could get away with it." I turned the phone around, showing the screen to the room. The damning messages between Rachel and Brad, the ones filled with passion and deceit, were there for everyone to see. There was no denying it now. Brad looked like he might collapse. He staggered forward, his hands outstretched. Wait, let me explain." I cut him off, stepping toward him with a calm, controlled anger. "Explain? You mean explain how you've been screwing my wife? How you've been planning to run off together while destroying everything I've built?" The room was silent, the tension thick enough to choke on. Rachel stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, her body trembling. Brad was sweating now, looking around the room for some kind of escape, but there was none. "You think you can just walk away from this?" I asked, my voice cold. "That you can wreck my life, ruin my marriage, and there won't be consequences?" Brad's lips trembled as he stammered. "Mark, please." The door behind us burst open and two uniformed officers stepped inside. The room shifted in surprise, everyone turning to look as the officers made their way toward Brad. "Brad Morrison," one of them asked, his voice loud in the now silent room. Brad's face drained of all color. What is this?" The officer held up a piece of paper. "You're under arrest for embezzlement and corporate fraud." The silence in the room shattered as Brad's knees buckled. He tried to protest, to stammer something incoherent, But the officers didn't care. They cuffed him, reading him his rights as he whimpered and struggled against the inevitable. Rachel stood, rooted to the spot, her eyes wide, her hands shaking. What? What's happening? What are they doing? I turned to her, my voice quiet but firm. Brad's been stealing from the company, Rachel. He's been using his position to cover it up. And now it's over. Her face twisted in shock, disbelief, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from Brad as he was dragged out of the room, his protest fading into the hallway. Rachel collapsed into a chair, her face buried in her hands. The room was still, the weight of what had just happened settling over everyone like a suffocating blanket. She was broken, and Brad was gone. The two of them had thought they could outsmart me, but I'd beaten them at their own game. I stood there watching as her world crumbled around her, feeling the weight of my own victory. It wasn't sweet, it wasn't satisfying in the way I thought it would be. But it was enough for now. The house felt emptier than it ever had before. Rachel was gone, her things packed up and taken out one agonizing box at a time over the last few days. She had tried to avoid me, her face a mask of shame and defeat whenever our paths crossed. I didn't make it easy for her, lingering in doorways, watching her from the couch as she wordlessly filled her car. There was no fight left in her anymore. No sharp words, no snide comments. She was hollow, drained. I had made sure of that. But now that she was gone, I didn't feel the rush of satisfaction I thought I would. Instead, the house echoed with the silence she left behind. I wandered through the rooms that were once ours, feeling nothing but the chill of an emptiness I hadn't anticipated. Her side of the closet was bare, the bed untouched on her side. It felt like I was walking through a crime scene, a life that had once been mine, now abandoned. I paused in the hallway, staring at the spot where her favorite picture had once hung. A framed photo of us in happier times, back when things were simple. I'd thrown it out weeks ago, smashing the glass in a fit of anger after I found the emails. Everything about this house reminded me of her. Of them, of what she and Brad had done, but now, with the silence pressing in around me, I wasn't sure what I had left. I moved to the kitchen, my feet dragging across the hardwood floor. The place looked the same, but it wasn't. Every inch of it felt tainted, touched by the lies and betrayal that had lived here with us. I opened the fridge, stared inside, then shut it again. The thought of eating made my stomach turn. I grabbed a beer instead, twisting off the cap and tossing it across the counter, watching as it skittered to the floor. I didn't bother picking it up. What was the point? I took a long drink, leaning back against the counter, feeling the cool glass in my hand. My mind wandered back to the look on Brad's face as the cops dragged him out of that restaurant. The panic in his eyes, the way his knees buckled, as if the weight of everything he'd done had finally caught up with him. It should have felt good to see him taken away in cuffs, to see him get exactly what he deserved. And in the moment it did. But now all I felt was numb. Rachel's face swam into my mind next. The tears, the trembling hands, the way she had collapsed into that chair like the life had been sucked out of her. I had broken her, just like I'd planned. She had played her game, and I'd made sure she lost. But instead of feeling victorious, I felt hollow. Like I'd won a battle that wasn't worth fighting. I drained the rest of the beer, setting the empty bottle on the counter. I knew what I needed to do next. It was time to get out of this house, to get away from the memories, the ghosts of the life I used to have. Staying here would only drag me deeper into the void I was already sinking into. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through the contacts. My finger hovered over a name, Dr. Cohen. I hadn't seen him since, well, before all of this, before Rachel. But I remembered how calm his voice had been back then, how he seemed to understand what no one else did. I made the call. "Mark, it's been a while," Dr. Cohen said, his voice as steady and warm as I remembered. "What's going on?" "I need to come in," I said, the words coming out quicker than I expected. "I've been through some things." "Of course," he replied without hesitation. "Why don't you come by the office tomorrow? We'll talk." I hung up, feeling a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. Seeing a therapist felt like admitting weakness, like I couldn't handle the mess I'd made. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just about Rachel or Brad anymore. This was about me, about who I had become in the process of tearing them apart. I didn't recognize that man in the mirror anymore. The next morning, I sat in Dr. Cohen's office, the familiar leather chair creaking under me as I shifted uncomfortably. His office hadn't changed much, still the same bookshelves filled with psychology texts, the soft lighting casting shadows on the walls. He sat across from me, a notepad resting on his knee, but he hadn't written anything down yet. He was just waiting, watching me. "So, where do we start?" he asked, leaning forward slightly, his tone gentle but probing. I stared down at my hands, picking at the frayed edge of my sleeve. "I found out my wife was cheating," I said, my voice flat, "with her coworker." Dr. Cohen didn't flinch. He nodded, waiting for me to continue. I I made them pay for it," I said, the words tumbling out now, as if saying them out loud would make it all real. "I exposed them. I got him fired. I had him arrested. And how do you feel now that it's over?" I hesitated, my mouth dry. How did I feel? Empty, lost, like everything I'd done had been for nothing. "I thought it would make me feel better," I admitted, finally meeting his eyes. "But it didn't. I just feel, well, hollow." He nodded again, not writing anything down, just listening. "That's understandable, Mark. Revenge often promises satisfaction, but it rarely delivers the kind of closure we expect. What you've been through, betrayal, the loss of trust, the breakdown of your marriage, it's left scars. And while you've retaliated, it hasn't healed those wounds, has it?" I shook my head, looking away. "No, it hasn't." He leaned forward a bit more. "You've been focused on them, on what they did to you, on making them suffer for it. But what about you, Mark? What do you want for yourself now?" The question hung in the air, and I didn't have an answer. What did I want? I hadn't thought about that. Everything had been about Rachel, about Brad, about destroying them. I hadn't considered what came after. "I don't know," I whispered. "I don't know what's next." Dr. Cohen leaned back in his chair, his eyes soft but serious. "That's okay. We'll figure it out. But first, you need to start letting go of what's happened. Holding on to the anger, the pain, it's only going to keep you stuck in this place. It's time to think about what you want for your future, for your life, now that they're not a part of it." I nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. Letting go. It sounded so simple, but I knew it wouldn't be. How could I just move on from everything I'd been through? From the betrayal that had ripped my life apart? But maybe that was the only way forward. After the session, I walked out of the office feeling lighter, but still uncertain. The road ahead felt long and I didn't know where it would lead, but at least I had taken the first step. The next few weeks were a blur of small changes. I put the house up for sale, deciding it was time to leave the past behind. Every room felt like a reminder of what had happened, and I couldn't live in that shadow anymore. I needed a fresh start, somewhere new, somewhere Rachel had never been. I also started reaching out to old friends, people I hadn't seen or spoken to in months. It was awkward at first, explaining why I had dropped off the map, why I had isolated myself. But most of them understood, offering support without judgment. It felt good to reconnect, to remind myself that there was still life outside of the storm I had weathered. One afternoon, I found myself sitting at a cafe, flipping through job listings. The freelance graphic design gigs I'd been scraping by on weren't enough to hold my attention anymore. I needed something more stable, more fulfilling, something that would help me rebuild the life I had lost. As I scrolled, an ad for a design firm caught my eye. It wasn't flashy, but it looked promising. I sent off my resume, hoping for the best. As I sipped my coffee, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Sophia, an old college friend I hadn't heard from in years. She'd seen my post about moving and wanted to catch up. A small smile tugged at my lips. Maybe it was time to start thinking about dating again. Not right away, but eventually, I wasn't the same person I'd been before Rachel. I wasn't even sure who I was now, but I was starting to believe that wasn't a bad thing. Change was terrifying, but it was also necessary. In the end, I had gotten even. I had torn down the people who had betrayed me, exposed them for what they were. And while it hadn't filled the emptiness I had expected it to, it had given me something else: clarity. Revenge wasn't the answer, it never had been. But maybe, just maybe, it had given me the space I needed to move forward, to rebuild. As I looked out at the street, the world buzzing with life around me, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough.